sea levels are not a threat. We continue to subsidize construction in storm pathways, okay? Say lawyers and lobbyists and lawmakers' homes in the Outer Banks of North Carolina. You can't insure a house if you build it there, because with about the same probability as a train coming down the tracks, if I should choose to build a house on the train tracks, your house will suffer severe damage and maybe get wiped out. We know this. That's why you and I are all paying for federal insurance to build lawyers, lobbyists, and lawmakers' homes on the beach, because the market wouldn't insure them. So yes, the dollar damage from storms is going up, but the actual storm frequency or severity is not outside of the bounds of natural variability. We have quiet periods, we have noisy periods. We were long predicting, the people who do this for a living, were long predicting an increase in storm activity, and it was a little overdue, and 2005 was quite noisy, and 2006, not one hit the U.S. shore. Well, the models didn't predict that, so it didn't happen. The 90s were the hottest decade on record, except that they weren't. What happened was, in 1989 to 1991, the Soviets and the Russians had other things to worry about. Chechens, loose nukes, loss of an empire, revolution, loose nukes. They didn't really care about maintaining Siberian measuring stations. And guess what happened? We closed thousands of them. By we, I mean the Soviet Union. Thousands of northern latitude, cold weather latitude measuring stations. And suddenly, we don't see an increase in temperature. We see a shift in the 90s coinciding perfectly. And I recreate the chart twice in my book. It's very powerful. Perfectly with shutting down half of the world's surface temperature measuring stations almost. Suddenly had the hottest decade ever. If you want to cool the planet, reopen those Soviet measuring stations, and I assure you, we'll suddenly be very worried about the cooling again. It's hot in here. Okay, again, people say, well, don't you believe in global warming? You tell me what year to start, and I'll tell you if it's warming or cooling. Or if you tell me your answer, this is what happens in policymaking. Here's my answer, get me there. What's your answer? It's warming. Okay, then the starting time is the 70s. Yes, it's warming since then. Since 1650, absolutely. Warming significantly. Since 1940, no. Since the year 1000, cooling. Since the Roman warming in Jesus' time, cooling significantly. Since 1998, cooling. That's absolutely irreconcilable with the theory that ever-increasing concentrations of carbon dioxide, which is just this, it's the noise when you open that can of Coke, it's the head on some of your beers, it's plant food, it's released by the ocean, it's natural, it's not carbon monoxide. That's a great confusion. We had a senator who, if only for entertainment purposes, I'm very sad he's gone, Lincoln Chafee from Rhode Island. He was one of those Northeastern Republicans who was so well informed on the issue that he lectured MIT professor Richard Lindzen saying, you're saying the carbon dioxide is not a problem, but look at all the people who asphyxiate themselves in their garages every year. And it's on the Senate record. And Professor Lindzen, who doesn't suffer fools gladly, was quite kind, and he said, I think Senator Chafee's statement is really making my point that this is an issue about education. I mean, and Harry Reid said, stop denigrating my senators. And all of this is on the record. In fact, it's in my book. So this is an issue about education. People believe that carbon dioxide is carbon monoxide. They forget that what they were taught in school. It's plant food. It always has been. It always will be. Weather happens. It used to be warmer. Storms happen. Wealthier is healthier. Where would you rather ride out the same grade of storm? Bangladesh or Florida? And why? Think about it real quickly. Well, one has institutions like insurance. One has infrastructure, communications, emergency services, automobility, wealth. One will suffer tens of thousands dead, and they have. Same grade storm. The difference is wealth. There are a third of the people in the world who have never flipped a light switch. And I assure you they're not going to stand for that for another 100 years. And no, when you flip the switch, it doesn't make those windmills start turning. That's no way to provide electricity, but that's precisely what Europe and the Kyoto files are saying. If you develop Africa and parts of Asia, if you develop, it has to be through the least efficient, most expensive, most land-grabbing, I'll call them technologies. They are what we used until about 150 years ago. That is renewables, wind and solar. We left that age for a very good reason. The industrial age was not, and the Industrial Revolution was not an accident or an inevitability. It happened only because man's innovativeness unleashed the power of hydrocarbon energy, fossil fuels as we call them, oil and gas. And so now we need to leap forward, as they say, into new technologies like windmills. My wife is from Denmark, and she can't not chuckle when she hears that. New technologies, windmills. Sea levels, glaciers. Glaciers are melting, and they are melting all over the world. The problem is glaciers are also advancing all over the world. Frozen things have a very limited repertoire. They shrink, they grow, and they break off like in Al Gore's movie where you're supposed to be sad because that implies melting. No, when a glacier calves, which is what that is, it grew too far. The horrors. It grew too far, it must be melting. Okay, calculation, expect a miracle here. It doesn't add up. But it's a great visual. People say, why don't you have a movie counter to Gore? Why a book? Well, imagine 90 minutes of things not melting. I mean, it's not very compelling. But that's what we do. So there are some video treatments of this out there, and I'll recommend The Great Global Warming Swindle, which is available on Google Video, maybe still YouTube. It's got its critics, just like Gore does, because you know why? The science isn't settled. Science is, here's my hypothesis, challenge that. And they're trying to redefine it. Tom's already covered all this. So I'll just say, if the science is settled, why are we spending in the U.S. alone, taxpayer dollars, $5 billion every year in climate-related research? Is that a lot? I don't know. They waste a lot of money. Here's how much it is. We spend $5 billion a year sending it to the National Cancer Institutes every year looking for a cure for cancer. Is that science settled? Okay. So the science isn't settled. And every scientist who insists that it is, because they want to be important, they don't want to be a government weatherman, they want to be a rock star, and they don't want to put their hat out every year for appropriations, say, great, it's settled. Where should I spend your research money? I say, well, by settled I mean you got to take me seriously. The science isn't settled, and we know this, as we know by the quiet hurricane season of 2006. I'll just throw out a couple of statements I heard from this Naomi Oreskes. I can't tell you what the temperature will be January 5th. Somebody from the audience said, how do I respond to the skeptics who say you can't predict the temperature 5 days out, but you're telling me what it'll be in a century? Very good question. And she said, well, I can't tell you what the temperature will be on January 5th, but I can tell you what the average temperature will be in the month of January. What's the word? A lie. That's a lie. No, you cannot. And I know she cannot, because I read her essay. It was not a paper, an essay in Science Magazine, 1 page long, subject to a correction later, because it was not true. She said, there is a big temperature spike going upward and continuing upward to the present day. Lie. It's cooling slightly. The UN said it would increase about another, I forget, 0.45 degrees Celsius since 1998. And over that period of time, it's cooled about that amount. And they can't explain it. So they're saying, well, it should be warmer. There's some reason and soot and explanation and absorbing and reflecting. Who are you going to believe, me or your lying eyes? It comes down to that. I told you it was going to be warmer, so this isn't really happening. And I'm not oversimplifying this. It's generally in pointy head speak, but they say this. I've got a really good reason why reality isn't what you're experiencing. That's not science. She said there is no contrary hypothesis that can explain the observed effects, with one exception. Okay, as you know, the ice caps are melting on Mars. Jupiter's moon Triton is warming. Is it Venus? Pluto, if you still consider it a planet. The Earth. All of these planets in the so-called, this is a term probably made up by some show for the oil industry, solar system. But what do we have in common? It's this fiery ball in the sky whose activity does what? Correlates perfectly with surface temperature. And I assure you, CO2 concentrations in the air do not. How do we know this? Look at last century. It cooled significantly enough during the 40s to the 70s that we had a global cooling panic. It was a panic. It's in the media, which is now in my book. We have satellites. Several of the billion are actually spent every year on the satellites, put up in the late 70s because of the global cooling panic. And they discovered it wasn't cooling significantly, but it's not warming appreciably either. And the only warming we really find is in the northern hemisphere. Southern hemisphere didn't get the memo. That's inconsistent with the theory. Southern hemisphere is largely covered by water. Northern hemisphere is a lot more land. You know a quick way to warm the surface of the Earth? Pave it. And we're doing that. And it's called the urban heat island effect. I can't tell my wife this, she'll call the realtor, but I broke this killing a snake the other day. Not running from a snake, but he did die. Because I had put my son out on top of a copperhead, sitting on my front stoop because it was warm there. This was a few weeks ago. Cement retains radiation. Cities are warmer than the countryside. Parking lots are warmer than wheat fields. We are warming the northern hemisphere, but not alarmingly. It's not even unprecedented.